My name is Nichole. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm a group practice owner, as well as being a coach for high achievers and perfectionists to help you start living in your life rather than constantly running through it. I help individuals with burnout, imposter syndrome, high functioning anxiety, perfectionism, and all the negative effects of it. And I help you learn how to regulate into your own system and show up as a better version of yourself. I really like this topic, and I actually want to give you tips, skills, tricks that you can't Google. And the reason I want to give you a lot of these different types of skills is because there's so much information about communication, and communication is really the foundational piece for how we connect to each other. The history of communication is really beautiful as well, right? But I want to give you the things that you can't necessarily Google. And I'm going to do this in a twofold approach. So I'm going to first start off with how perfectionists and high achievers struggle with certain types of communication and why they do. And then I'm going to talk about all the tips and tricks that I would love for you to take away after sitting with me this evening and spending some time. 2 weeks ago, we talked all about boundaries, and we talked about how boundaries require a certain level of communication. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how that relates to perfectionism and high achievers, as well as how we can communicate our boundaries really effectively. Please do not hesitate to drop anything into the chat. If you have really specific questions, now is the time to ask. Communication can come off and be really specific in a lot of different areas, although there's really amazing tools for optimizing communication in a positive way that can be like the overview. But there's a lot of specific pieces that we either don't always talk about, or we don't understand, or we don't see how it's holding us up. Drop anything you want in the chat. Even if you want to give an example or ask a very specific question, now's the time. Take advantage of that. Let's talk first about some of the areas that perfectionists struggle with in terms of communication, and where we can get stuck a lot of the time. So I'm going to go through, there's 5 of these that I've identified, and then we're going to do some examples that go along with it. Also too, I take notes when I build out all these presentations. If there's something that you want in terms of a note, let me know and I will drop it in the chat so everybody can have it. It's not a secret, so I can share this information with you. And if you're more of a visual learner instead of an auditory person, I totally get it, just ask. So the first area, perfectionists often struggle with the difficulty with expressing themselves. Perfectionists may struggle to communicate their thoughts, feelings, because they feel like they need to have everything perfectly formulated before they speak. This can lead to a lack of assertiveness and difficulty in expressing themselves effectively. Let's give some examples of what this would look like. Being told that you're too rigid with email replies. I work obviously with a lot of high achievers, with people that work in HR, with people that work in these different types of executive jobs where they're sending out these mass emails. And this is one thing that's happened a lot more, especially with females, where they're getting these reply backs of, hey, you're being too rigid in your responses, or it doesn't feel as friendly and accepting. One of the areas too that this comes up most significantly is with text messaging, right? Like when we're messaging or DMing. And what's happening here is that there's a lot of assumptions coming in on both ends, but there's also this difficulty with expressing themselves. And I'm going to tell you guys too, as a recovering perfectionist, as a high achiever, sometimes I fall subject of this, right? Where I'll message somebody something super quick and super to the point. And it's not because I'm not trying to take that time out. It's because a lot of the times I don't have the time to sit there and write the full response that I'd want to. One quick tip just to like kind of navigate this very off the bat, because I'm going to be throwing all kinds of quick tips at you tonight. Tell that person, tell them, I really want to spend some time on replying this. I read what you wrote, but I'm going to put it on my to-do list, and it's just not going to happen for a little bit because I have some other things that are priority. Great way to communicate that. Not saying something that bothers you, just letting it fester within you, not wanting to ask for your needs, or not to inconvenience someone else. I was recently having a conversation with a wonderful coaching client. We were talking about the idea of not wanting to inconvenience somebody for a glass of water or something to eat when we're at their house, or not wanting to overstay our welcome, or things along these lines, right? Like these very strategic pieces. Perfectionists and high achievers don't want to put anybody out of their way a lot of the times to do something. And so a lot of the times they'll sit back, sit into themselves, and silently suffer. Huge issue here. Because what really actually has to happen is that people can't read your mind. People can't assume what you need. And so we need to be able to express our needs and do it in a way that feels empowering and very beneficial. The reality is not everybody is an amazing host. Not everybody knows what to do next. And asking somebody for a glass of water or asking somebody for a little bit of space isn't you having too high of a need, right? It's a basic need. I think the communication issues that become the most difficult are the ones that do feel much higher. I notice this a lot of the times. I tell every single therapy client that I work with, if you need something between our session today, the end of our session today, and the next time I see you, email me. I will do my best to fit you in. I can't guarantee anything, but if something comes up, email me. The worst thing I'm going to say is I can't fit you today, or I can't see you until your next appointment. Almost 9 times out of 10, I can get them an appointment. I can get them in. I can take that time, and I will. And it's not me overstepping a boundary. It's me leaving enough space in my schedule to be able to manage and navigate that. That's that first part that we've gone over a bunch of times with productivity, with boundaries, with all these different pieces. But that moment is so important. It's so important for communication. It's so important for connection and giving that space and that access for a need. You're asking for your needs. I'm going to do my best to show up with it. If I can't, I can, right? Think about that in a couple different terms of how that might exist with the ways in which you struggle with asking for your needs. Number 2, fear of criticism. I did a little Instagram poll today on my stories, and this one actually had a pretty low percentage, which was really interesting to me. Perfectionists may be afraid of being criticized or judged for what they say or how they say it. I truthfully think that a lot of perfectionists don't want to admit that they are fearful of being criticized. But this is not just a perfectionist thing. This is a human thing. Especially if we've experienced communication in really negative ways in the past, right? If we're constantly judged or we're constantly criticized for the ways in which we have shown up or said something, we start to really withdraw and not communicate our opinions and not show up in those spaces. This fear can cause them to hold back their opinions or avoid communication altogether. Examples: withdrawing completely or avoiding saying anything. I'll be honest with you guys too. Sometimes I can even be pretty critical in my opinion of something, especially when it relates to mental health stuff. Not because I'm the all-knowing expert of mental health things, but because a lot of the times when people are bringing something up about mental health, I do have an opinion or this is my niche area. And so it's important to me for people to be able to express their different areas. And a lot of the times I have to step back from that whole situation and ask people, do you want me to respond as my interpersonal self? Do you want me to respond as a therapist? This is really, really interesting too for the ways in which we professionally and personally show up in different relationships. Sometimes some of us notice that certain people will utilize us in communication or with interpersonal relationships as our role. I am the person that a lot of people call when somebody dies. I have no issue with that. I that is a wheelhouse of mine, and I don't mind supporting it if I have the capacity. For instance, though, if you are somebody that works in finance, or you're somebody that works in investing, or you're somebody that works in marketing, or you're somebody that works in engineering, right? People may reach out to you for very different specific things. It's your job to really identify how you show up within that communication and how you're eliciting that information. Because when people start to believe, or when you personally start to believe that you're becoming or being viewed as critical or harsh or judgmental on something, more assumptions start coming out. We're going to talk more about this in a little bit, but more assumptions start spearing up. And then our personal selves start going into what's called personalization. We're going to talk all about that with cognitive distortions next week. But personalizing is taking on that information and then assuming that we caused issues, right? I'm going to put this little asterisk in here too. Sometimes this actually can be helpful. Not the idea of like the fear of criticism, but the fear of having certain communication boundaries with things that we do and do not talk about. Politics, religion, right? These are two really good interpersonal and communication boundaries to have with people that may or may not, or that we know may or may not see things, understand things, or communicate with us in a way that we feel that is effective. We'll talk about that some more too. Number 3, need for control. Perfectionists often want to control every aspect of a situation, including communication. This can lead to rigid communication style that doesn't allow for flexibility and adaptability. Not all perfectionists are like this. Not all people are like this. But a lot of the times when we get fixated on a notion, we can show up with this belief system, with this thought process, with this understanding, and then we don't really leave space or flexibility for anything else to happen. You guys, a really big belief of mine is that a goal of ours is to connect. And that's really what we seek, is connection with others. And the foundation of connection is often communication. And what happens a lot of the times when we walk into different types of communication situations is that when we're holding a need to control that situation or that communication, we don't leave space for anything else. And then we start to wonder why we're not getting a lot of other insight from people. And maybe it's because 1, we're not saying anything, 2, we're just agreeing with everybody, or 3, we're just very rigid in our thinking. And this is all people. But when we start doing that, we start creating these barriers. We prevent a lot of other opportunities to come into play. This can cause them to appear indecisive or uncertain about communication. This can lead to rigid communication style that does not allow for flexibility or adaptations. Examples: overstepping by overdoing and overgiving. This is that piece of need for control, right? I am so guilty of this, especially when I worked in the hospital system. I worked a floor called med-surg, which meant I got anything and everything in terms of diagnoses and needs and certain things like that. And I had a couple RNs that worked as case managers working with me, but a lot of the times I was the only social worker on the floor. And there was very specific tasks that I could do, but a lot of the times I would overdo. And I would overgive, and I would show up in different ways, and I'd support the patient, and I'd support the family, and I'd support the medical team. And there wasn't a lot of really thick boundaries there. And a lot of the times I was trying to control it to make sure that it was an easy discharge, make sure that the patient was comfortable, to show up exceptionally in that. But this also meant sometimes I stepped on people's toes that I didn't necessarily mean to. And the most important aspect that could have been the number one resolve in the beginning of this is having proper and suitable communication. Having those moments where it's coming to me or me going to that person and saying, hey, this is how I'm seeing something, would have resolved a lot of issues before they actually even arose. Especially too when working in teams. When we're working in teams, we really struggle with the way in which we are being heard and we are being understood. And there's usually somebody that takes over as that leader piece, but then also we have to operate all together. So that need for control becomes really strong in that leadership position. But if we're all working as a team, that equality needs to be spread out. And this is where the communication is the best for kind of navigating, where do we go from here? How do we communicate this? The most successful teams are the ones that communicate truthfully. This also looks like saying, don't worry, I'll handle it. And anybody that identifies too as like a giver, or somebody that's like a matriarch or patriarch within their family system, or somebody that's constantly offering up how they will solve it, there needs to be communication with that first piece of asking for our needs so that we don't get burnt out and resentful later on by not asking for anything that we need and not following that same piece of how do we lay out the understanding of this communication to align, to connect. Not being open to receiving input or feedback. There's this part of the presentation that I was going to say later, but I've been thinking about it a lot today, and funny enough, it came up in a couple of my sessions today earlier, and it was about people saying, I am fearful of confrontation. And a lot of the times, to me, when somebody says this, I'm like thinking in my head, you are uncomfortable with confrontation for whatever reason, right? X reason. But also, what is making you uncomfortable about confrontation? And I want you to sit with that while we're talking about this, right? What does confrontation mean? Because confrontation is almost like the word selfish. It gets this really bad rap. But the reality is confrontation is communication. Confrontation just seems more severe than communicating. But if you change it and you say, I am comfortable with communication, I am comfortable with bringing up some of the confrontation that may exist within communication, how many more doors does that open for you? Number 4, overanalyzing. Perfectionists may overthink and overanalyze what they say and how they say it. Hello, high-functioning anxiety. Leading to self-doubt and second-guessing and high-functioning anxiety. I didn't write that, but I'm saying that. This can cause them to appear indecisive or uncertain in their communication. This is the one for all those individuals who often feel shut down for their opinion or talked over. Yeah. So this is when there's people in that team that constantly don't feel like they can actually raise their hand and say something or show up or show value and express, right? And it's okay if this is a way that you identify. A lot of the times it depends on what groups we're in, that we sometimes really struggle with showing up and doing that. For perfectionists and high achievers, a lot of times they look at this like, I don't have that highest level of value, so I'm not going to say anything. And what that actually does is it causes a lot of harm, because their lack of showing up equals now their lack of connection and their lack of communication. Like that lack of communication equals lack of connection. When we replay something a million times before just showing up to the conversation, it may make it much more difficult to manage and deal with. Oh, I love this. I think being a therapist a lot of the times means that I get to hear more of the inner workings and the difficulties with how our thinking patterns are aligned or disaligned, right? And I think it's a privilege to be able to sit with people in their headspaces and let me help them detangle certain pieces. What I think is not helpful is reeling and what's called rumination. So sitting with heavy, intense feelings or playing a situation over and over and over again, all typically related on how much we can and cannot control a lot of the times, and then assuming that we have more control over it. One of my favorite tricks for this is I do a activity or intervention called the control wheel. I use this in both therapy and coaching, but for the purposes of this presentation and keeping that example at a minimum, write down everything. Write down, when you have a situation, write down all the things involved with it. Are you going to confront this person? What could come up out of that? All these fears, anxieties, all those different things. And then cross out every single thing that's not in your control. See how many things are left. And that piece will help you to understand what you need to communicate more. All or nothing thinking, number 5. Perfectionists may have a tendency to see communication as either perfect or a failure. Unless you're going up for a huge award or certificate, right? And even in those moments, there's not a lot of different types of communication that are just a complete failure or utterly perfect. Yes, there are people who are better speakers. There are people who are better presenters than others, right? But a lot of the times our communication does not fall, 100% of the time, it does not fall into perfect or failure. There's a huge spectrum here. And a lot of it is all based on perception. This black and white thinking can lead to unrealistic expectations and disappointment when communication does not go exactly to plan, which often leads to high functioning anxiety and other things that we're having difficulties with. Communication is easiest when it is fluid, open, and has availability for alterations. Communication is the foundation of relationships. When we can come to recognize the power that exists within communication, we can make improvements. Okay? So here are 5 ways high achievers, perfectionists really struggle with communication, and same with people. You don't have to identify as a high achiever or a perfectionist in order to experience any of these. Like I said before, guys, too, I want to give you the stuff that you can't Google, but I'm actually going to give you a resource that you can look up later. John Gottman and his wife are famous. John's a physician. I'm not sure if his wife is. But they're famous therapists who work with couples counseling, and they have a couple amazing pieces to help, interventions to help. They actually have a whole therapy called the Gottman approach, but this one, the 4 horses of communication, is really, really helpful for within relationships and understanding different parts of stonewalling and the ways that we show up within communication. You guys should definitely take a look at this and check it out at some point. It's very digestible, though. It's not something that needs a ton of explanation, but they actually can tell within 15 minutes of listening to a conversation within a couple if that couple is leading more towards divorce or more towards connection, or what that actually does look like for them based on the way that they communicate. They have some really cool techniques, so if you're bored later, go ahead and look that up. I had an excellent question get asked today on my Instagram stories, and it's going to lead us into the second part of this presentation. How do I compose my thoughts in my mind to communicate a response from my boundaries? And I think what is so powerful here is that what happens interpersonally for us is not the way that we often want to show up or the way that we hope we will show up. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we show up just absolutely flawless. But I'd be lying to you if I said, hey, like I had this belief that I was going to show up for this presentation and it was going to go splendidly and I wasn't going to make a mistake. I just made a mistake asking this question or rereading this question. It happens. There's no point in me sitting with that for much longer. Let's move on. Anybody that's here and knows me too knows that I make mistakes. We all do. Going into a situation emotionally charged is going to make the reaction feel and appear more emotionally charged. This is where nervous system regulation is so important. Let's say I have a client come into me for a session, and we're having a conversation about the way in which they want to communicate a boundary to someone they love, a friend, a family member, a colleague, whoever, right? It doesn't have to be somebody you love, but let's just say somebody close to you. The first thing that we're going to start to understand is where and what are the emotions that are charging this to happen, and what is happening around the situation to make us feel like we can or cannot properly communicate to that person. If fear is that driving force, we're going to come into this in a different way. We're going to come into the situation just being nervous about saying something, which means it's not going to be presented in a way that's going to make us feel good about this. When we can regulate our internal boundaries and our nervous system, we can really calm the situation down. So this question is asking, how do I compose my thoughts in my mind? Number 1, take a break for just a few minutes. Especially if you're in a charged situation, especially if you work at a hospital, if you work at a very busy place, if you work with people and you guys are constantly you need to take just a second. And it is okay for you to take that second. It's okay for you to just take a few minutes. You don't even have to tell that person, hey, like I'm taking a minute, unless it makes sense to, but I'm just going to take a second and I'm going to try to calm myself down, because whatever you said or whatever boundary feels like it needs to get set here needs to be composed first in my mind. My favorite sentence, and you guys are more than welcome to use it, take it with whatever you need. I'm going to marinate on that. Let me marinate on that. If I don't have the capacity to show up in that space in that moment, my communication technique is I don't know that full answer. And to be honest with you, where this technique came from is when I was working in the hospital and I was in huddles and I got put to a new floor, or I got put on in, the ED, or something was going on. And the physicians or the attending or anybody would be, well, what do you do? What's the next step? Like pressing me for like all the things. And I'm like, I will get back to you. Or stay tuned, or I'm going to marinate on that. And immediately what would happen when I made like this little sarcastic joke and like just showed a little piece of my personality of being that sarcastic social worker, everybody would kind of laugh for a second, but it would take the pressure out of the room. Like, I don't want to give you the wrong response, so let me just put a pin in it for a second and I will come back to you. I'm regulating my own nervous system. I'm pulling humor into it. And then I'm just kind of calming everybody down. Like, promise I'll call you later. What's your extension? But I'm not going to heighten this and I'm not going to throw gasoline on it. Our internal boundaries are really important too, guys. Making sure that we are not taking on and personalizing other pieces. When we're trying to compose our thoughts, when we're trying to grasp our understanding and our thinking towards us, we need to take a couple minutes just to regulate ourselves. This may also mean a couple days. It may mean you have your therapy session before you have that communication. That's perfectly okay. That's what those supports are there for. I'm going to give you a bunch of other examples on this too. There is no singular approach. I think that there's helpful approaches, and I think that everybody's is going to be a little bit unique. I like being a little bit humorous with a lot of the ways that I'm communicating hard information, difficult information. Not in the sense of using humor as a defense mechanism, but in the way that it helps people to feel just connected and a little bit more light in what we're talking about so that we can have deeper, heavier conversations. That's not everybody's approach. And it's going to be different a lot of the times, which is why I'm having a lot more flexibility with this presentation, with some of the things that you guys are putting in the chat box too, is because although there's some great general pieces, there's also a lot of specifics that happen with communication. And you can look up all the different things about active listening, open and closed-ended statements, and all that. You can Google all those things about the key pieces of communication. But what really happens when we're sitting there communicating with somebody is not all those definitions that we looked up online, but the emotional response that we're experiencing a lot of the times, and how we need to get something across or how we feel like we can't. And there's just this huge barrier between us communicating our need and not communicating our need. I'm going to give you guys a quick example too. My husband and I, the house that we were living in prior to this, I was up pretty early in the morning. I'm an early riser. And I want to talk about reactions. So this is where this is going. So let's talk about reactions for a second too. And this is kind of where this is going. We were living at this house. I don't know. It was like 6:30 in the morning. And the way that the road worked, operated, was that some people had driveways and some people didn't have driveways. And so a lot of people would park on the street, right? So street parking. And it was really early and I heard a huge crash, just this huge crash. And I looked out the window and I saw just smoke and cars like jumbled together. So this car must have been going, 50 miles an hour down the street, and it hit both my neighbors across the street's car. It just like hit the one, I don't even know how it happened, and then it hit the other truck, right? And it was just an ultimate crash. I see a girl get out of the driver's seat of the car, and I see her go to the back seat. And my first immediate response, right? My first thought is, she's gonna run. And so for the sake of my neighbors, but also because I'm concerned about the girl and all these different things, I blast out the front door and I run down to the scene to kind of see what's going on. I'm like, hey, where are you going? She's not going to run. She's actually grabbing an infant out of the back seat of the car, out of the car seat. And my reaction was immediately angry, right? I was upset about it because I was like, I thought she was grabbing a purse and something else and going to take off. I did not think that she would be pulling an infant out of the back seat of that car. Plus, I wasn't hearing the infant cry, and that made me even more nervous, right? So I immediately look at her. I just take a second, I stop, I regulate, right? And I go, look at me, hand me the baby, just hand me the baby, let me check the baby. She's all over the place. She's very reactive at this moment. She's very stressed out. She hands me the baby. I start kind of just doing an overview of the baby. At the same time, I'm screaming back at the house because I don't have my phone on me. It's like 5:45, 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm like, call a cop. I was yelling at my husband to call an ambulance and call the police and like screaming his name in the background. And I'm just checking out this baby. Another version of this situation could have gone very, very differently if I had not regulated and had not shown up in that space. Luckily, I have a lot of experience with kids not doing well because I've worked in pediatric care and I've seen a lot of kids not physically look well. So I'm checking the baby. Baby looks fine. Then I'm checking mama because mama's got blood all over her face. We got some situations going on here, right? There is something about nonverbal communication that's happening here that's very, very powerful. If we start reacting in a lot of these different situations, we're actually projecting our own fears into the situation. What's most important is how we stabilize. What's most important is how we sit with that. And no matter what, your system, your heart, everything is going to be going up. But once we can learn how to just take it down a notch and just show up in the best way that we can, that's what we can do. Baby's okay. Mama was okay. Everybody was okay, by the way. Just a very stressful morning and a lot of insurance is called. Same with the same thing when somebody offends us in a conversation, right? Is instead of reacting, I want you to take that step back, take a breath, step away, collect yourself, and determine what you want to do next with that. When somebody offends us, a lot of the times it can be very intentional or non-intentional, but a lot of the times it feels like it's on purpose, and that's really, really hard. It's okay for you to take a step away. It's not a weakness to do that. Let's go through different parts of communication tips and tricks related to different areas. So let's first start with setting boundaries and communicating needs, which is a great follow-up to the boundaries webinar. If you guys haven't catch that or you weren't with me during that, go look that up on YouTube. I'll link it in the caption of this YouTube video too. But check this out because this is a really good way to start opening up that approach. It often feels like we're asking for a lot when we're working on setting boundaries. This is why they're so hard, obviously, right? Or when we are asking for our needs. And a lot of times with perfectionists and high achievers, we weren't given a lot of space to ask for our own needs, or we were more of the idea of we'll just take care of it ourselves. It also may feel like a weakness to ask for your need. But it's actually the lack of communication that creates the real difficulty here. You guys, when you set a boundary, it's not this never do this again, right? It's more like, hey, I need to create a barrier here because what's happening is that this is causing me to feel really emotionally charged about something, and it's taking too much energy from me that I can use in other spaces. That is what a boundary is. Boundaries get this love-hate relationship that it must mean one of the things that we're doing is we're just preventing people to have access to us in some ways. Okay, a little bit, right? We are changing the access that we're giving to people, yes. But we're not putting that person down for needing that boundary. Does that make sense? When we start to come into this idea of we need to set boundaries, the hardest piece of it is the communication. Is how we actually communicate that to somebody else, that we need this boundary. And to be honest with you, and this is all over social media, and it's very true, and it's in most books that are talking about boundaries in different situations, when somebody reacts on us, it gives us that validation that, yeah, we needed to have that boundary set. We needed to focus on that a little bit more, and that needed to happen. It's okay that it makes somebody uncomfortable. What's not okay is it leading to an argument and exiling the relationship and ending the relationship. That's not going to do us any good. So let's try it this way. I want you to start to recognize first, off the bat, it's never going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes. And the most important thing that we can understand with making mistakes is that if we have a connection that is solid and supportive enough, and we can keep working on improving that communication and come to terms with our person about how this boundary needs to be set and how it can be set, we can start to make change. We're not trying to hurt somebody by setting a boundary, guys. That's not what we're doing. When we communicate it appropriately, it really helps for us to align better with what we need. Okay, tip number 1, notice what is active, meant for a later time, or abandoned with communication, whether it's positive or negative. So here's the 3 parts. Active communication would be like a working, drivable car that you use every day, like your everyday car, right? This all relates to communication. I'm going to tell you how in just a second, but I'm going to give you pieces of this example so you can create a visual in your head. So active would be the working, drivable car that we use day to day or every day. It's on the road. It's more of what we considered active communication or active topics. So my husband and I are talking about dinner. That is a car we're driving every single day, right? We have to eat dinner. So what are we doing for dinner? friends and I planning an event or communicating with doctors about a medical situation, right? Like these are active, well-functioning, we're on the road, we're doing that. This is all that type of communication that's just, it's good. It's going. It's happening. Is it super deep communication? No, we probably only have a couple options for dinner. So it's not going to be, this elaborate type thing. It's more of the like surface area stuff. Part. This is the part 2 of this. Think of this as finding a parked car in a parking lot, or having a discussion when the timing is better. I want you to really think about this parking lot piece, right? Because there's a great example that we used. I used to use it a lot in play therapy and when working with kids. I'm like, we're going to park that for right now. And I still use it with some adults, but it's more of like a kid reference in my mind. Let's park that and we'll come back to it, right? This is where a lot of these conversations are important to have, but the timing might be off, right? Like not having that in front of everybody else or in front of a group of people. This is that conversation that actually gets brought to therapy a lot of the times. These are the conversations, all that stuff from your parking lot comes into therapy. Like I need to discuss and process and understand these communication pieces. How you want to communicate a boundary and the language you want to use. This is where we're making that shift. This also relates to how you want to discuss a topic related to something that bothers you, and maybe it's not the right time. So trying to think of a really good example of this. So let's say that somebody said something to you at a party or an event or a situation, and it really bothered you, but instead of embarrassing that person or calling them out, you're just going to say, I'm going to put that in the parking lot and I'll come back to that with them later and kind of tell them like, hey, it hurt my feelings when this happened, right? That's the parking lot communication stuff. And then we have abandon. And I want you to think of like conversations that exist that have become abandoned within a relationship, things that you can't talk about. This is really common in intimate relationships that are really struggling with communication. So it's what makes communication even more difficult too, because the more abandoned cars, the more communication topics that we have that are just really left on the sidelines, the harder it is to talk about the active communication pieces, the car that runs fine every single day. When we start to identify what type of communication or what area that we need to start to regulate, we can start to see like, okay, like how much access does this have? Can I just get in the car and turn it on and we're good to go? We can have this conversation. Do I need to go to the parking lot and find this car in this crazy parking garage and start to figure this out? Or do I need, this abandoned car needs to go to the shop. We need to get all kinds of different support on it. Like it needs an oil change. It probably needs a transmission. Start seeing it that way. And start identifying which topics are going to be the harder areas to communicate the boundaries with. Even looking at it as that's a tough boundary for that person because they constantly come to me for those different types of things, versus this is going to be an easier conversation because I can just tell that person like, hey, I really just don't want to talk about politics during the election time. Is that okay with you? Sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's not. It depends on who we're talking to, right? And that's okay. First, begin to identify where the communication is and what it would look like and what it would mean to talk about it. Not asking for things doesn't make you an easier person, you guys. And so we have to learn that the more things we can make as active transportation, active communication, and bringing up within these different situations, the easier it's actually going to be to have that connection. A lot of my clients and a lot of people tell me they're like, I want to be with this partner where I have nonverbal communication and they just understand who I am and where I'm coming from and what this looks like, and I don't even have to say anything. Well, that's great, but the only way that exists is through the active communication that's happening and the active listening that's happening in that functioning car every single day. Start thinking about that more, right? That person that you feel like you don't have to communicate every need to is that person that also knows a lot of the things that would make you feel really good and helpful and enjoyable, right? There isn't a person that doesn't know me that doesn't know that I walk around with a giant water cup, right? And that I typically want water. So if somebody offers me water, I'm 9 times out of 10, unless I already have mine very full, I'm going to say yes. And I'm not inconveniencing anybody by doing that. Number 2. Okay, it matters how you say it and what your internal narrative is within the situation. This is so darn important, guys. Your tone matters a whole lot with what you say. Saying something like, Okay. Very closed response, right? I am not looking for suggestion. Okay. Question mark. Okay. Like, all right, I got it. Whatever you're trying to kick to me is not something I'm going to follow, right? I just said the exact same word in 3 different tones and in 3 different types of afflictions, right? One of my favorite techniques to help with assertiveness and to help with giving like a closed-ended statement to when somebody is putting a lot of pressure on us to complete something is the use of okay. When I was working in the medical field, and when I was working actually at a counseling center, and when I was one of the youngest clinicians there, I would get told a lot, right? Like how bad I was doing my job or what I wasn't doing in my job or whatever. And one of the responses that I had to really sit with a lot of the times was, okay. It changed the whole dynamic, right? If I put gasoline onto this conversation and onto this approach and onto the way that this person is projecting different things and all the jobs that aren't part of my job description onto me, I'm going to create more problems for myself. If that person can recognize, I do hear you, I'm actively listening, and I understand what you're saying, and okay, that's what we're going to do. And the favorite statement that I would follow up that you guys are all welcome to steal is, we are going to work we're going to do what we have with what we can, right? And that's it. We're going to just take that. We're going to work with what we can. We'll figure it out. This actually helps to even keel and regulate all these different pieces that can be really supportive with communicating something. Rather than saying, oh, that's never going to happen, or you're overthinking that, or you're overworking that situation, or good luck with that, or being offensive in some way. Okay. And your tone matters. Your tone constantly matters. Keep that in mind. The internal narrative. This is the other most important cofactor. When we are communicating, a lot of the times what we're thinking and seeing and understanding is only our perception, right? It's the perception that we are walking into the situation. One of those questions that I asked on the stories this morning or earlier today was basically, what is a statement that you hear pretty often, right? Like, oh, you're overthinking this. And the one that drives me up the wall a little bit is, you're probably thinking. Don't start sentences with this, guys. Unless you are a psychic and you can literally identify what that other person is thinking, which I don't have that superpower. Congrats to you if you do. You saying that statement to somebody else is literally assuming and interrupting any thought process that they're having within the situation, because now they're saying, this is how you think I think? This is what you think I mean, right? This person starts like going into this whole situation. And a lot of times when they use that statement too, you're probably thinking, it also comes with this lovely offensiveness at the end. The internal narrative is the story that we tell ourselves before we get into these situations. One of the things that is really interesting about this is pulls on our insecurities, right? So especially when we're going to communicate with somebody about something that's really difficult, we go in and we assume they're going to be so mad at me. They're not going to speak to me again. They're going to think this about me. And a lot of those things are just insecurities that we're holding, but may not have any reflection of how that person sees you. Working in a hospital system, working in a team's, any type of past experience, right? Being over helpful can also feel like stepping on a lot of people's toes. So when we're communicating this, if we don't understand how that other person perceives the situation, or we don't understand why that other person's upset with us, a lot of the times, if we're stepping on other people's toes because we're trying to do everything, and that means that we're not giving the full percentage of what that deserves in terms of value, we're now creating a lot more chaos for how the situations are playing out. And what I want you to be really careful here is, what is the story in your mind that is going on here? What is happening before you even show up to the plate? One of the things that I find the most helpful, especially when I'm having high functioning anxiety, when I'm experiencing any level of anxiety, or when I'm just doing this, like, I am just assuming that I am the mind reader of the world and I can assume how everybody's thinking because I'm a therapist and I hear thoughts, right? Like, Cognitive distortion 101 for therapists. I will say to someone that I love, the story that I'm telling myself right now is that you are very upset with me because of blank. Is this true? And that will help to resolve and understand and navigate different kinds of situations. Here are a couple other sentence starters that will help decrease defensiveness and reactivity. I wonder, instead of suggesting to somebody like, hey, you should go for a walk, or hey, you should do this, say, I wonder what it would feel like if you took a walk for a few minutes. Or I wonder what would happen if you just figured out a way that you could navigate this situation differently. I'm curious about the way that you think about X situation. Forgive me if you already knew this. I've noticed. These are great sentence starters to help reduce that defensiveness, to work with the internal narrative, and to lower the tone, right? Instead of telling somebody what they should be doing, or instead of assuming that we know what somebody else is thinking, the one thing that we need to focus on is these sentence starters that will help with it. I wonder what it would look like if you did this. Assume that someone doesn't like me. You go into the conversation nervous and with this assumption that my narrative is, this person doesn't like me. I don't know how I'm going to convince them otherwise. This is that narrative piece. You're probably thinking versus you're overthinking these different situations. Tell me what the story is before you even go in towards setting the boundary. Before you even go to communicate your needs. What is the story that you're telling yourself that holds the insecurity that prevents you from being able to show up in that space? And is it, this person doesn't like me, this person doesn't want to be around me, this person feels this different way? Guys, these are assumptions. We're assuming. And then a lot of the times when we get interrupted all the time, it feels like we're not the person that has value in what we're bringing to the table. So now we start to do this backpedaling thing of, I must not show up in the way that feels good. That's not necessarily the case in the situation. People are egocentric. They're focused on themselves a lot of the times. And we have to recognize this when we're communicating, is that none of us, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to overgeneralize. Most of us didn't get tons of communication skills growing up. That's why one of the questions on the poll today too was, what was the communication like growing up in your household? What did that feel like? Okay, couple other tips that I want to drop to you. What if someone takes your okay as an agreement or assent? How do you correct that? So we have to be really careful about how we use this. But I think adding an ending is really helpful here. And it can just be as simple as, okay, I heard what you said. I will follow up with you when I have time. That's it. Okay, I validate your need for whatever. This is where I will, this is the date that I assume I will have this ready for you by, right? It's good to ask for clarification, and this is one of the most beneficial pieces about communication, is that we have access, time, and space to ask for clarification within communication. But make sure that this person is starting to understand what's going on. If they're telling you all the things that you need to do in your job and kind of like peeking you out on all these different things that they think needs to get done in that, great, okay. That doesn't necessarily, and don't assume, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're just like taking it all in that moment of, okay, great, then they'll take care of all these different things. But there's no point in reacting. Okay, cool. That was exactly the scenario. There's no point in reacting more with that person either, right? So if I say okay, and they're like, okay, great, you take over everything. That's not what I meant by okay. What I meant was, okay, I hear what you're saying. We'll have to come up with a plan for it, but this meeting isn't that time to make that assessment or to make that plan. So we'll follow up an appointment or we'll follow up with a meeting, and I'll email you for when that's going to happen. Very closed-ended. You're only giving one option here, which is we'll park this and we'll come back to it when it's actually appropriate time, because right now we're working on this other humongous project. Some other tips. Guys, take this tip as much as you can and start using it with everybody that you love, cherish, hold close to you, right? Are you looking for a solution, or are you looking to vent out? There is nothing wrong with our need to vent. This is how a lot of us externally process. This is a lot of us are getting connection with each other. It's how a lot of us are finding that space in between. However, if we have people that are constantly coming to us all the time and they're dumping, either trauma dumping or venting on us about all their situations a lot of the different times, we have to recognize how much energy that's taking up from us. But we also need to come into it and just say, hey, I've noticed that one of the things that happens a lot is this trauma dumping. Are you ever looking for a solution here, or are you just looking for a space that you can vent? This is going to make somebody uncomfortable for a minute, guys, most of the time, right? And if they haven't watched this webinar, it's going to make them probably even more uncomfortable. It's okay. It's not that you're trying to make that person uncomfortable. It's that you're trying to create a little bit of resolve here to conserve some of your energy and help understand the balance here. This is so helpful too within relationships, guys, within our romantic relationships, within friendships, within siblings, parents, all those different types of things. Because what it does is it helps that person to actually acknowledge what they're doing. But what it also does is it helps create this understanding of what is the goal here of this conversation. This can be so, so, so helpful. So write that down. Are you looking for a solution? Or are you looking to vent? 15-minute breaks. I don't know where this one came from, but it's an old school one that I've been using for a long time. I think I had to do like a CEU for communication when I was working with couples in LA. And I think that's where it came from, because my husband and I actually practiced it a lot when we learned about it. And I learned about it and then I told him all about it. We can't take back what we say, right? Once those words are out there, they're out there. But what we can do is, before the conversation starts to go really negative or go really intense, we can ask for a step back. We can ask for a break. And both partners, both people have to agree that this break is okay to create between the two of you. And it's better to do that when you guys are in a good space, not in a bad space, by the way. Agree that it's okay for you to step away. And before you say anything that you can't take back, just go take 15 minutes. Go walk the dog, go clean the house, go take a shower, go sit out back and watch the sunset. Like, just separate. What this will allow you to do is reflect, be angry, try to justify to yourself why you're angry, try to understand like where they're coming from and how ridiculous this is. You're going to go through this whole argument without having your partner there, and that's great. Or without having your person, whoever it is, right? A friendship even too. But if we can take those 15 minutes and kind of just settle down on the argument, it can shift the entire dynamic with how the communication. Because the goal is not you against your partner or you against another person. It's you and this person against a problem. And if you could switch that dynamic to see situations differently, it changes the entire way that you guys communicate. It creates so much positive nonverbal communication. It creates so much connection. It changes the dynamic every single time, because you don't cross the boundary all the time with saying negative things, saying hurtful things, really getting underneath each other's skin and saying things you can't take back and now you just want to be forgiven for. Allowing time for processing information. Not all of us process information at the same speed other people do. I have a great example for this. It's something that happened today. I really want to paint my husband's office. I really want to decorate his office. We've lived in this house for over a year. I have been thinking about this for a while, how I want to do it, what colors I want to go with. There's certain things I want to hang up in different places, like the organization behind some of the stuff, whatever, right? Like, my right hemisphere is going to town and has already planned out and mapped out my husband's entire office and how I want it decorated. We were at Home Depot a couple weeks ago and I picked up swatches. And I've been thinking about the swatches. And today I asked this man, I said, what color do you want your office to be? And in my mind, I've narrowed it down to 2 options. I can't find the swatches, by the way. But I've narrowed it down to 2 swatches and I have no reference to give him. And I'm like, sir, which would you like? And he's like, I don't know. Of course he doesn't know. He probably doesn't remember what the swatches look like. Not a problem. He has not been sitting in my brain on the right hemisphere of creativity planning this out the same amount that I have. I need to give him time to process different situations. With communication, this can be so empowering when we do have that moment with our partner and we go, hey, there's this situation that I'd really like to have a conversation about. I'm not upset with the things that are going on, but I'd like us to process this a little bit more. And I want to give you enough time for you to think about this on your own. Your partner is probably not thinking about what two colors you picked out from Home Depot to paint his office with. But this also relates to bigger topics. Your partner or your loved one or your family member is probably not thinking about how they vented on you and it caused you a lot of grief and exhaustion, or you lost capacity or energy, right? Give people that time, but also don't set it up like a time bomb. Set it up like, I want to have a conversation about this and I know it's not the right time and I want to give you time to process it. Then we can come into it together. Huge, helpful communication technique. Use it with work, use it with relationships, all kinds of things. Oh, last one. Come up with a word or a phrase that you find helpful to communicate with somebody close to you or with somebody who's actively working with you all the time, that helps that person understand where you're coming from and when you need a little bit of space. I have one of my lovely therapy clients. I taught her this trick and she came back to me with this story. She gets really frustrated in grocery stores sometimes. And she said, I use the banana sandwiches trick. And I said, please tell. Please let me know what this was. She was getting very frustrated at the line at the grocery store when they were checking out, something about things being bagged a certain way. And her card, she went to put her card in the machine, it wasn't working. It was like one of those just epic fail moments of like nothing happening correctly. And she literally looked at her partner and she just said banana sandwiches. And she just walked out of the grocery store and left her partner with the stuff and just had that moment. And he came out of the grocery store laughing at her. Before they even had this understanding, they knew exactly what they were talking about. She had informed her partner, hey, like when I use this phrase, it just means that I have to step away before I become really reactive, before I see something I don't mean, before whatever, and I'm going to need you to take over. Can we do this all the time? No. But this is a great way to support each other within any type of relationship, especially within a colleague relationship and a work relationship too, right? Having something where that person can step away and you can show up stronger, or you step away and that other person show up stronger. Banana sandwiches is one of my favorite because it's kind of just like, it's BS. I don't know what to do about it. I can't fix it right now. Let me just walk away from it. Come up with that communication with your person, with your colleague, with anybody that you might be struggling with. Really start to come into alignment with what you're needing and wanting to say and how it's okay to show up in different spaces. We can't assume that we know what the other people are thinking about, guys. We can just ask. And the more asking that we do, the more showing up that we do, the more that we try to align, the deeper the connection is going to be. When you've given someone the processing time, what's a good way to reintroduce a difficult topic? Great question. I think the one thing that can be like the best follow end point for this, right, is, hey, I really would like to have a conversation about X, but I don't think now is the right time and I want you to have enough time to process that situation. Can you come back to me, or is it okay for me to check in with you about this in a week or so? For us to have that open alliance with being able to talk about it again. It doesn't have to sound that well put together, right? You got to remember, a big part of therapy is communication. So yeah, I want you to start to pay attention of asking your partner, when is it a good time for me to bring this up again? How will I know that you're ready to communicate about this? And how can we get better into a system that demonstrates that we can both find alignment with it? This is really helpful too. One of the past webinars that we did in February, I brought this up, and it was about check-ins with our partners and just taking anywhere between 5 or 10 minutes to check in the morning or check in the evening and just be like, hey, how's it going? And as a partner on the other side, it can be really helpful for us to say, I've been thinking a lot about what you were talking about related to X. And us show up in that place. But giving that person that space, and then also just asking, when can I follow up with you on this, is totally acceptable. Aaron, think about it too in terms of a work capacity. If that person said, when can I follow up with you on it? How much time would you need? And use that reflectively within other relationships. Thank you guys so much for coming this evening. If you have any questions related to communication, please let me know. If you have any follow-up, I am so grateful that you guys were here this evening. Next week, it's going to be Cognitive Distortions Part 2. We're going to be doing control fallacies, always being right, personalization, and jumping to conclusions, which will be a great follow-up for this as well. Thanks, guys. Have a great evening. Go enjoy dinner or whatever meal. I will see you guys soon.